This is the Energy Education Podcast for February 3rd, 2013. I'm Kevin Hurley. This week, we'll talk about the recent cyber attacks that were launched against the Fairwinds web servers. We'll discuss what we know and what we don't know. Also, we'll talk about a double standard that's applied to the nuclear workforce, why some employees are being treated differently, and why the punishment doesn't always fit the crime. Later on the show, we'll discuss a leak at Japan's Hamaoka plant. A saltwater leak into the reactor was believed to be the first event of its kind. However, Arinie's here to share his experiences with that same problem at Millstone 1 decades ago. So today we're doing something a little bit different. We have Arinie Gunderson on, as always, and Maggie Gunderson, the founder of Fairwinds Energy Education. We thought it would be a good idea, Maggie, to bring you on following the little incident we had this week.
Yeah, that was quite a surprise to have a distributed denial of service attack, to have a malware attack. I'm beginning to get a handle on what happened when our website was brought down. And I'd really appreciate it if you'd explain to our listeners more about it, since that's your technical end of things.
From what I understand, we were attacked by something called a fragmentation attack, where rather than a computer opening a full connection with our web server, it sends malformed data and overloads the part of the server that sets up the connections. So unfortunately, we don't have much information about where the attack came from or who might be behind it, but certainly we're taking steps to make it so that can't happen again as best we can.
Well, thank you, and I'd especially like to thank the server managers and owners, because they just did an amazing job of getting us back online, and so did the team working with you in a very short amount of time. So thank you, Kevin.
Oh, no doubt. I think we gave them quite a busy day. I spent probably a grand total of 2 hours on the phone with them. And, it's definitely worth pointing out when people or whoever, launch an attack like this, since we are on a shared server with other web pages, this didn't just affect our web page. This affected other web pages on the box, or on the same server that we sit on. So, it really wasn't just us, and they were really great, and they haven't kicked us out of the house yet. So, all good news so far.
Well, that sounds excellent. It was interesting for me to read this week that the New York Times had also been under attack by a wholly different group, and it's one of the flaws of open internet and technology, but I don't want to see a closed internet either.
Well, I guess we should let Arinie join the conversation too, you think?
Well, Kevin, hi. Thanks for having us again. What interests me about this is that the other engineer I work with, a guy named John Large in England, had his servers attacked about 2 weeks ago also. And the only thing the two of us have in common is that we're both working on the San Onofre plant.
Well, what a coincidence. I want to, though, get into what the point of our show is meant to be. And I also want to apologize to the listeners. We didn't have a podcast last week. We delayed our podcast, and we delayed it long enough for the server to go down. So our apologies to the viewers, to the listeners, for not having a podcast last week. The topic of this week's podcast is the double standard in nuclear power plant working environments. Why are some nuclear plant workers being treated differently than the nuclear plant higher-ups when they do something wrong? Arinie, if you could start out, I know you have several, but if you could start out with one example of something that happened to an Oyster Creek employee.
Yeah, just this week, and a person on the Oyster Creek staff, not in the senior management, but somebody working his way up through the ranks, was terminated because of something the person did way back almost a decade ago. This person had a DWI, and didn't report that to his management way back a decade ago when it happened. Ultimately, he did, but it was a long time in between when it happened. And that shouldn't happen. You know, you're supposed to report these things. There's no doubt the employee was wrong a decade ago when he didn't report it. But what happened now is that the NRC convened a full-blown process and then decided that this person should not be allowed to work at Oyster Creek because of a mistake the person made 10 years ago. And that's their policy. Now, I'm okay with that. The person didn't tell the truth, and nuclear, you're supposed to be truthful. But there's really a double standard at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You know, they treat the people in the organization below senior management to one standard, to one very tough standard, whereas the senior managers get off the hook for doing things, in fact, far, far worse. Let me give you an example. Just about the same time this employee was having his DWI, a plant out in Ohio near Toledo, the Davis Besse plant, had a near miss. The nuclear reactor rotted through, so there was, instead of 8 inches of steel, there was only about a 1/4 inch of steel left.
And when you say a near miss, you mean almost a meltdown.
Yes, it would have been, had the plant run about another month, it would have been a meltdown right outside of Toledo. So this was serious. Now, there were all sorts of warnings that management overlooked. And management overlooked them because they wanted to keep the plant running until the next refueling outage. They were making money all winter long when they could, when the cost of electricity was the highest and their profits were the highest. So management was overlooking all of these signs. Then what happened was when the flaw was finally discovered, the NRC turned its guns not at the management, but at one engineer in the organization who didn't check one box on one procedure. And that engineer was drummed out of the industry in a federal trial. Yet no manager at Davis Besse was even indicted, let alone sent to prison. Now, Davis Besse had to pay a multi-million-dollar fine. There's no doubt about it. But, you know, that's chump change to these guys. When you put a manager in a situation where he goes to jail, then I'll believe that the NRC doesn't have a double standard.
So the situation at Davis Besse basically boils down to the fact that they were warned about this, that it may be a problem. They decided to continue, and then when there was a problem, they let the head of one of their loyal workers roll rather than taking the fall for themselves at the management level.
Yeah, and I wonder, too, why weren't they penalized for what it cost the ratepayers? I mean, how long was Davis Besse shut down, Arnie, and how much, did that cost their ratepayers?
Oh, yeah, that the company suffered is no doubt. But did they suffer adequately for the fact that they jeopardized the entire Midwest? Not in my opinion, they didn't. And it begins when managers know they can go to jail, then things change. You know, the NRC has never put a senior manager in jail for any kind of misdeed related to operating a nuclear power plant. You know, Davis Besse's example number one, but there's a lot of other examples out there.
Yeah, the one example that I know of personally, a woman that I know who brought a lot of safety concerns forward for a number of years, to safety concerns about a nuclear plant in her community, and she brought it forward to the community. She brought them forward to the NRC, to her state legislature, and she was very active in trying to have the plant operated safely and have it follow its own regulations. And one of the key officers, I think he was an executive vice president of nuclear at that particular company, put his sights on getting rid of her. And so he called her boss at the company, where she worked. She worked for an entirely different firm, no connection. And he called her boss to boss, upper management to upper management. and proceeded to advise her boss that he should fire her and that she was irresponsible and vindictive.
But of course that had nothing to do with her job at her own company. He knew nothing about her performance at her own company. He was trying to stop her from having the resources to be an activist, I suppose?
Yes, yes. And she was not what I would call anti-nuclear. She was what I would call pro-safety. And she wanted the nuclear plant run safely and for it to follow its regulations. So this executive vice president called her boss, and he didn't know because she had one last name and her boss had another last name, that the president of the company where she was employed was her brother. And it was a family business that they had taken over, and both had key roles within the company. So her brother went to the NRC with the allegations and proof of exactly what happened. And this executive vice president wasn't fired, wasn't put in jail, nothing happened to him. Instead, he was just quietly allowed to resign, get his pension, and go about his life, as if it was normal.
So what brought this whole conversation up was what happened to this poor engineer out at the Oyster Creek plant. So here's a guy who loses his career because of not reporting a DWI in a timely fashion. And yet we've got executives at Davis Besse and executives at the company Maggie talked about who just get a walk. They get their pensions, they get their retirements, and in some cases they even keep their jobs. So that's what we meant by the fact that there's definitely a double standard. Management, senior management, with lawyers to fight the NRC, gets off the hook, whereas the low-level employees are on the hook.
And that's no surprise to me. I mean, the NRC does it with their own. And at another date, I'd love to do a whole show with you about the NRC and an Inspector General investigation that found out about an NRC executive who lied under oath, who covered up an investigation, who was proven to neglect the investigation and cause a cover-up. And he was given a promotion, several for fact, and continued his $150,000 a year salary until his retirement. I mean, it's just outrageous.
And now that NRC executive is now working for the nuclear industry, arguing that almost every plant that he is brought in on is more than safe enough to continue operating.
All right, well, let's make things a little bit more technical now. Arinie, the word saltwater intrusion has recently come up in nuclear news, and it's a little vague for me. I don't find myself understanding what that means. Can you explain to me what is a saltwater intrusion and why is it in the news? That's a great term of the nuclear industry designed to obfuscate what really happened. The Hamaoka plant in Japan had a leak in the condenser. The condenser is what separates the ocean from the nuclear coolant, and it's what cools the turbine. And normally there's pipes that separate the two. Well, at Hamaoka, the pipe broke and clean salt water, so non-radioactive salt water, came into the nuclear reactor. So much salt water came in that the nuclear reactor had to shut down, likely permanently. Well, what happened was that this story was covered about 18 months ago, and the Japanese press said it had never happened before. And I read the story and I said, that's baloney. I know it had happened before because I was an engineer back in the 70s when it happened. So I contacted the guy who wrote the story, and I explained to him that it had happened at Millstone Unit 1 back in 1972. And one of the things I did was I developed 3 coupled
partial differential equations to explain how this accident happened. It took me a month to write 3 equations, and then we modeled it on a supercomputer and solved it. But I wrote the report back on Millstone. This is in the 70s, and this is back in the days of typewriters. And I had the secretary type out that in 1972, the Millstone plant experienced a, quote, serious saltwater leak. Well, my boss saw the report, loved the analysis, but he made the secretary retype the front page, and he changed, quote, serious saltwater leak to, quote, a saltwater intrusion. So that's where the term comes from. Arnie Gunderson was the first to put it in a typed memo because his boss changed the term serious saltwater leak.
What did you think at the time?
I didn't even blink an eye. It's part of the propaganda that you begin to accept when you're in the nuclear industry. You know, you all begin to speak the same way. So it was just my first lesson in nuke speak, if you will. So what happened after that was that that plant was shut down for a year, and it was nowhere near as serious a leak as what happened at Hamaoka. But apparently, nobody told the Japanese that a reactor like that could have a leak, and if the leak happened, it was likely to do some real serious damage. Saltwater and stainless steel do not get along well at all. And anybody who's ever had a boat on the ocean would know that the stainless steel gets pretty well damaged. And, of course, the stainless in a nuclear reactor is at 500 degrees. So Hamaoka shut down, but they had no knowledge that it had ever happened before, nor had the Japanese regulator, until I contacted the reporter, and the reporter got me talking with the regulators and the people at Hamaoka and explaining the situation. So finally, as a result of my involvement, the Japanese regulator and the people from Hamaoka sent a delegation over to the NRC, and they found the old typewritten reports that I had developed, which were instrumental in them determining that Hamaoka probably could never be started up again.
I was really surprised at this whole chain of events as it unfolded, because the utilities, energy companies have owners groups that meet on specific model plants, and they're international. So supposedly these owner groups are supposed to get together, have technical discussions, share technical papers, and bring up any engineering, safety, or reliability flaws that they find, and discuss it and look for technical solutions together. And that's just not happening.
You know, this all makes me think of our webpage, actually, how all of the content that goes into our webpage is connected with keywords and meta tags. It would seem that it might be possible for the regulators of various nations and the international nuclear authorities to have this sort of information in a database. So perhaps they could just type in saltwater intrusion and say, oh, well, here's a memo from 1972 by Gunderson. I guess it's not that easy for them.
I think you're absolutely right. The nuclear industry should pay a little more attention to what goes on the Fairwind site, and maybe they'd actually learn a couple technical lessons. That doesn't seem to happen very often.
All right, well, I guess that will do it for this week.